Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Ukraine, Russia, China show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star. Our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Yeah, glad to have you, Jonathan. How you will explain what's happening in the last few days in Ukrainian. Is it war? Is it a peace? Is it a fair? Is it, I don't know how Putin call it, special military operation? And yet another point of view is that it's a merciless killing of Ukrainian kids, women, and men. So you can think any way you feel is comfortable for you, but what will it tell us, Jonathan?
Well, I will tell you that the Trump administration, for all of it making an honest effort to try and bring peace, to try and bring an agreement, they have run headlong into an entirely incompatible viewpoint, that of Vladimir Putin and the Russia and his leadership, which has an irreconcilable political goal with that of Ukraine. Ukraine desires independence, sovereignty, and to be able to go their own way and to forge their own destiny. Vladimir Putin believes that Ukraine has no right to exist, that they ought not to exist, that they have always been part of Russia and always will be part of Russia. And he believes in any means necessary in order to achieve that end. No matter how many Ukrainians he has to kill, and he desires to seize Ukrainian territory, he has designs beyond Ukraine to expand Russian influence beyond Ukraine into Europe and to eventually, in his view, to restore the former Russian Empire, because he considers the dissolution of the Soviet Union to have been one of the greatest geopolitical disaster, in his words, of the 20th century. So, given that kind of mindset that the West is confronted with, diplomacy becomes next to impossible for the West to achieve an end to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And as I've been contending all along, and that my point of view would be more compatible with that of Sir Winston Churchill, because, as you recall, Winston Churchill, in his study of the Russians, said that there is nothing that the Russians respect more than strength, and nothing for which they have more contempt than weakness, particularly military weakness. And so whenever the Russians, leaders such as Putin, sense weakness of any kind in their adversaries, they will press remorselessly ahead, not negotiate maximalist positions until either they have achieved their objectives, or they are forced by military defeat to at least temporarily give up those objectives. So right now, in spite of the fact that what seems to be very hopeful, that what is hopeful about all this is that Europe seems to have united along with President Trump in trying to gain some sort of negotiated peace. The problem is one side does not want peace, and that side is Russia, does not desire peace. They desire only to press ahead. And this is going to be a very thorny problem for both the United States and for the European allies that are backing Ukraine. Ukraine right now, they see the situation very clearly. They are under no illusions about what they are confronting. They are confronting an existential threat to their own existence. And so they must continue. They, as I've been contending, they have so far successfully resisted and inflicted enormous casualties on the Russian army, and they have inflicted severe damage on the Russian economy and on their logistics system and on their ability to continue offensive operations. And the military correlation of forces, at least, in my opinion, is moving steadily in favor of Ukraine. What remains to be decided is, will Ukraine be able to avail itself of a suitable opportunity to execute a decisive counteroffensive? And some analysts concede that Ukraine might be able to execute a counteroffensive somewhere at some point. But what I've been contending, as you well know, is that the decisive center of gravity of this entire conflict is the Crimea. And if Ukraine can obtain a decisive military counterattack at a time and place of its choosing, in order to be able to cut off Crimea from Russian reinforcement and logistics, then the Russians in Crimea will be isolated, and that will give Ukraine the opportunity to use a strategic reserve, which I believe they have been creating and have set aside for this opportunity, to be able to execute that counteroffensive and force the Russian surrender of the Crimea, which will be a decisive prerequisite for obtaining any kind of ceasefire or armistice, which right now in my mind is the best case. And hardly anyone in the West is willing to say, "Oh, this is going to be a long slog." And President Trump has said that he wants to stop the killing. Well, fine, you want to stop the killing, but what if your opponent does not want to stop the killing? Well, then you have a problem. You have to hit him hard enough to be able to accept the fact that your opponent is not going to yield until he has been decisively defeated in one form or another, whether it's economically, diplomatic isolation, or an outright military defeat. And that's pretty much the summation of what I would have to say. It's an unpleasant reality. We wish it would be better. We wish that human beings were decent enough to be able to know when to stop fighting. But unfortunately, if human beings were decent to begin with, wars would not be fought in the first place. So the very fact that we're asking human beings to act contrary to their basic nature. And so,
Jonathan, I have a question. If Trump is negotiating peace between Ukraine and Russia, he must have some advisors on Russia-Ukraine, and then explain to him that Russia is absolutely in no position to stop the war, even for one day, not 30 days or 3 months or whatever. Why? First of all, Russia has certain goals that it is eyeing to achieve. And realistically speaking, if the help from the West would stop, Putin would be much closer to achieving his goals than otherwise. Number two, Putin cannot stop the war for a very simple reason that there will be 1,000 of well-armed bandits who are killing people in Ukraine, and they will come back to Russia. And what do you think they're going to do with
they're going to kill Russians?
All this salaries? They're already killing in Kursk region, the villages that are being so-called liberated by Russians. So people are being killed, which is another form of liberation, by the way. So this is going to be duplicated in all Russian territory. So how Putin in his right mind, even if Trump will promise him new business in Arctic and there, and how he can agree to that? He can't. So what will
Yes, he is caught in Zugzwang.
Putin is not. Putin is not in Zugzwang. It's Trump is at Zugzwang. Putin will continue the war until he is alive, and because he's younger than Trump, most likely, and good health and so on, most likely he will outlive Trump. So Trump will never see a peace between Russia and Ukraine before he'll pass away. So what will take Trump to understand that for 8 months he was working reasonably hard on stopping the war. Putin didn't yield even 1 inch or even half inch to Trump in 8 months, with all the telephone calls and Witkoff trips to Moscow, and now meeting in the Alaska red carpet, and just name it, nothing is happening. So Trump, I can't believe that he is stupid. Probably not. So then how time does he need to understand there will be no peace? Because Putin can't afford one. Putin cannot afford the peace. Therefore, there will be no peace, regardless all the talks and negotiations. It's a major distraction that allows Putin to continue his killings of Ukrainian children and women and men. And with all these peace talks now in its 9 month, it creates, hopefully unintentionally, a great cover for Putin to continue his killings. Jonathan, please comment on that.
Okay. Well, I would tend to agree with you in that this produces a very difficult situation that the Trump administration will eventually realize that they cannot, through conventional diplomatic means, achieve a cessation to the war in Ukraine through normal means. They will eventually be compelled and persuaded, I predict, by their European allies that eventually in dialogue with the Europeans are going to say, look, Mr. President, as much as you wish to achieve a negotiated peace, this is clearly impossible. We will have to apply both sanctions as well as increased military aid, as well as give Ukraine all of the means and allow them to conduct with whatever means they have and are willing to use, the ability to oppose and defeat this Russian invasion. And the thing is, the correlation of forces as far as military losses, damage to the Russian economy, the indicators are that Russia cannot, contrary to what is trying to claim, they cannot continue this war. Their capability is not going to increase over the coming months and years. It is going to steadily decrease. And eventually they will reach, I will project by the end of this calendar year, that Russia will have reached a point where they simply cannot continue any significant offensive operations other than random terror attacks or random missile attacks, as their ability to produce and sustain a war effort simply will not continue much beyond the end of this year. So what we'll have is a very bloody stalemate. And by the way, Ukraine is very correct not to give up that part of the Donetsk, that where they have constructed that very strong defensive line, which has frustrated Russia for this entire period of this entire war. And that is one of the keys to their successfully being able to block any further Russian military success. And certainly they are not going to give it up in any kind of diplomatic agreement or so-called peace agreement, because as they have rightly pointed out, that would open the way to Kiev, being able to occupy that defensive line. So as unpleasant as the reality is, it is one that they will eventually, that the West, both the United States and its European allies, will have to face. They will be compelled to face it. And so the Europeans realize that their future security is at stake as well. And it's because they are convinced that their future security depends upon being able to stop Russia here in Ukraine, stop them, and best case, throw them back, to drive them back beyond that. That would be great if it could happen, but at least defeat them so that they cannot pursue offensive operations, at least for the near to intermediate future. And this will require sustained vigilance, sustained effort, something which the West and the United States has not been used to since the end of the Cold War. You recall, Sasha, during the Cold War, the United States and NATO, they had no problem being able to sustain military effort and buildup because they had a grand strategy. They had the grand strategy of containment, which was originally formulated by, as you know, George Kennan. And that provided the overarching strategic framework so that both presidents, that both parties, political parties, whether it's Democratic or Republican, they could operate under that grand strategy. No matter who was president, they knew what strategy they had to follow with respect to the Soviet Union. However, once the Soviet Union collapsed, and communism or socialism as a worldwide revolutionary movement was largely discredited, then the United States is confronted with no opponent. So what does it do? Well, they were operating in a vacuum. They were operating without a strategic framework. And unfortunately, when you have no strategic framework, then you have no way of prioritizing how you are going to spend your money on military forces, nor are you going to be able to be able to dictate when and where it is necessary to use military force. So the United States, since the end of the Cold War, has been operating in a political and military vacuum. And unfortunately, if you have no priorities, then they fall back on this bureaucratic notion of full spectrum dominance. And as I said before, full spectrum dominance is simply another way of saying more of everything is better. And because there are no priorities, then the United States keeps funding every type of military project that comes up because it's got to have a use somewhere. So that's quite unfortunate. And now the Trump administration, they will have to, if it is going to be more successful in this post-Cold War period, it will have to establish a firm and clear strategic doctrine, national military strategy that clearly prioritizes where we are prepared to engage, on what kind of military forces will we prioritize over others, because we can't spend it on everything. We didn't even do that during World War II. And be able to set that sort of priority. Without that strategic framework in place, they will continue to flounder. They will continue to try and spend money on just about everything in sight. And that is no way to conduct national military strategy. So that is an unfortunate reality. I wish it were different. I wish the Trump administration had also taken the trouble to formulate a clear and decisive military strategy, one that gives priorities to when and where it will act.
Jonathan, I have a question. That after the end of Cold War,
mm-hmm.
the first sign of something that is not right was 2008 under still President George Bush Jr. when Russia attacked Georgia, and that would take complete Georgia territory and its capital Tbilisi, except that it was time when the Medvedev came to the power. Putin was still in command realistically, and they stopped by annexing two Georgian territories, and they were adamant that neither Georgia nor Ukraine, when there were still no frictions or visible frictions between Ukraine and Russia, that these two countries will never join NATO. So speaks Russia. It remains to be seen what will happen in reality in the next few years. However, the real signal that something is not right has happened under Obama in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and started the long war of attrition in Donbass region. So now it was a time for Obama at least to pay some attention to that. Instead, he says that Russia is a regional power. Regional power, really?
Really, yeah. And by saying that, he unfortunately sent a signal that entire region was Russia's sphere of influence. And when he sent that signal, he created the pretext for future Russian aggression in that region, including Ukraine.
And he went farther. He went to Syria in the same, I think in 2015. He went to Syria under false pretense, and then but it's most thanks to Turkey. Recently, Russians had to get out of Syria in its entirety. So my question is, though, is now that U.S. will, as you used to say before on the show, the peace could be achieved by a nice way or a hard way. So probably Trump will come to the idea of a hard way, instead of a soft way or so.
I think there is precedent for that in American history, at least during the Cold War, because as you recall, when President Jimmy Carter came into office, initially he was talking about that he was saying that we should not have this inordinate fear of communism. He was very soft on, comparatively speaking, compared with previous U.S. presidents, on the nature of the Soviet threat. He was basically saying, well, there's not that much threat. But then, as you recall, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And that, in my research and so forth, that was a decisive escalation in the use of Soviet military power. Prior to Afghanistan, the Soviets used in the face of American nuclear superiority, strategic superiority, and other types of military power. The Soviets either initially threatened to use their military power, or they conducted war games around the area in question. Then during the 1960s, they began mounting logistics efforts, supply efforts to their allies. And then in the 1970s, once they had achieved strategic parity with the United States, then they escalated their use of military power once again, gradually, by using proxy forces, such as the Cubans in Africa and in other places. So again, gradually escalating the scale of their use of military power. But finally, in 1979, once the Soviets had, by some measures, achieved a measure of numerical superiority in delivery systems, both ICBMs and in submarine-launched ballistic missiles, a marginal strategic superiority, then they used, for the first time, military power in an area outside of their tacitly recognized Eastern European sphere of influence. They used it outside in Afghanistan. That represented a crucial escalation. But when that happened, President Carter's eyes were opened. At last, he saw the nature of the Soviet threat. And in response to that, he initiated the grain embargo. He also initiated the boycott of the Moscow Olympics, again, two firm diplomatic measures. But most crucially of all, in his defense spending, he was the one who actually initiated the major defense buildup that Ronald Reagan would continue and in effect accelerate during the 1980s. So that was a very decisive move. So there is precedent. Presidents can be made to change their mind and become more aggressive once reality slaps them in the face hard enough. It took Afghanistan to be the slap in the face to President Carter. And in this case, President Trump may not require so much the equivalent slap in the face, but he is certainly being given the finger by President Putin. And so this is one of these things where one of these lessons that the Trump administration is going to learn, however reluctantly, that there are some deals which cannot be cut because the other side simply is not willing to make a deal in the sense that you understand it. So this is, again, it's one of those very hard, difficult lessons that in spite of how good and how hopeful it seemed to be initially, we may have the framework here. And then Putin goes ahead and throws cold water on the whole thing by continuing his attacks. So it is going to be one of those lessons that the Trump administration may be the last to learn it. His European allies have already learned it. They already know it. That's why they are willing to impose sanctions, and that's why they are willing to provide military aid to Ukraine. So now this is a contest of political wills, and the critical variable here is how soon will the Trump administration recognize the true reality of the situation. And his current advisors either are unwilling or unable to recognize the true reality of the situation. Now, that can change. It is not static. The American system does allow for competing viewpoints to be input. And so, for example, it's going to be incumbent upon the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, because while she has conducted a purge or is reducing the size of the ODNI staff, it also opens the door for her to introduce other advisors, other types of advisors who do not necessarily have the same political agenda as the ones that were previously there under the Biden administration. So this is a very fascinating development. I contend that there is still time and opportunity for the Trump administration to further strengthen its resolve and support of Ukraine. In the meantime, the primary initiative still lies in the hands of Ukraine. They can still, they will recognize pretty much the way the Confederacy during the American Civil War recognized that it could not stay on defense. It could not stay on defense and hope to win the American Civil War. They tried to copy the formula for victory of the American Revolutionary War. Win a military victory that convinces foreign powers like Great Britain and France to intervene. In this case, in the case of the Revolutionary War, the French intervened on behalf of the American revolutionaries. In the case of the American Civil War, the Confederacy was hoping to gain intervention by either Great Britain or France, or preferably both, on the side of the Confederacy. But in order to do that, they had to win a convincing military victory that defeat the Union forces on Union territory. And they had to seize that initiative and make that victory convincing enough that Great Britain and France would be compelled to intervene and settle the whole matter. That was the reason for the Battle of Antietam, the invasion there in 1862, and it became the motivation for the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania in 1863. Both were intended to win independence by convincing Great Britain and France to intervene. Both failed, of course. Mm-hmm. But this is a similar situation now confronts Ukraine. Ukraine cannot win its independence by simply staying on defense forever. They could hope, theoretically, they could grind down the Russians enough to where they are incapable of undertaking significant military operations. But that is not nearly as desirable as being able to force the Russians to call it quits. And that requires a military victory, a significant military victory. And they have to be able to pick and choose that time. I do have very high confidence in the ability of the Ukrainian military and political leadership to be able to recognize that moment and to take that moment. They will not be timid about it. They know that their existence is at stake.
Jonathan, I have a question to you. If Putin understands that at some point Trump may revert to peace from position of strength, mm-hmm. and so that would be required at least one of two or both things. It's sanctions, secondary sanctions, and sending powerful, up-to-date systems, military systems, weapons to Ukraine. Yet Putin hasn't yielded even 1 inch in 8 months to Trump. What do you think motivation for Putin to continue what he does and ignore all the possibilities of position from peace from the strengths?
I think that I personally think that he is recognized. We don't know the exact state of his health, but we do. But there are rumors that say that he is dealing with things like cancer potentially, and other things that may be shortening his life. And there are other things that are speculating that he does not have that long to live. And Putin's recognition of his own mortality, of the fact that he may not have that much longer to live, contrary to, he may not be around his life, but Trump may outlive him. After all, President Reagan outlived three Soviet rulers. And Reagan was frustrated and said, these Soviet leaders, they keep dying on me. He was getting frustrated about that. But so it may well be that, shall we say, God may decide to take a hand in this and determine that Putin will live for only so long. And that if that in fact is the case, Putin may be recognizing that his own time in this world is limited. And he, in a desperate attempt, he is approaching his own equivalent of the crisis of capitalism. Remember when the Soviets used to talk about that? They were worried about that at some point, the capitalist leadership, seeing the continuing successes of the socialist revolution, will at some point become so desperate that they will lash out with their nuclear arsenal in a desperate attempt to retrieve the situation. That is why, by the way, the Soviet Union during the Cold War had a much to the consternation of the West, by the way. We could not understand it. They had a nuclear warfighting, war survival, and war winning doctrine. And the United States did not really understand that because of the political nature of their system, that it was necessary for political survival. They must be able to fight, survive, and win a nuclear war with the United States. Not because they were actually able to do that, but for their own political survival, they had to have that as a goal and be able to state that they were willing to engage, if necessary, in a nuclear war with the United States. So right now, Putin is facing his own crisis, his own crisis of leadership.
And therefore, he will not agree to any peace proposal.
Correct.
Your answer, right?
Correct. He will not agree to anything until he dies. Death must intervene.
Mm-hmm. So then what's the point of peace from position of strength if all that is built around Putin's possible death, whether sooner or later or not so soon? How you can define that type of strategy?
Well, that would be a form of aggressive containment. Yeah, aggressive containment. You have to be able to support.
Jonathan, there is no containment as we are talking about. There was containment in Cold War, yes, totally agree with you. There is not even a minor, just minuscule attempt to contain Russia at present. Russia is doing definitely whatever he is doing that. And the reason that, in my understanding, Putin ignores everything, whatever US or other countries imposing on him or trying to impose, is simply that he understands that neither of these two threats can materialize. US has no power to impose economic sanctions against Russia. Number one, that's it, that's the end of story, because China will never agree to any sanctions. And China, actually, there are two countries in the world who very successfully resist Trump's tariffs. It's China and it's Canada. And Trump has nothing to produce, no even shade of success in these negotiations. India, furthermore, said that it's an independent country and will decide what to buy, from whom to buy, at what price to buy, and sort of, therefore, even Trump's strategy against India is not going to work. So, therefore, he is insulated from these actions of U.S. and the West. And our second one is sending weapons to Ukraine. Now, if that will lead to further escalation of this war, then there is China, there is North Korea, and there are a few other countries that will provide Russia with abundance of arms and even fighters and the military technique and all kind of weapons. So therefore, even this one is rather muted. So if Putin, who is not a fool, and he is aware of all that, then indeed United States, represented by Donald Trump, has no way to influence Putin's motives and Putin's will to continue the war just by continue doing what he's done for 8 months. Talking and talking and talking and talking, and another week of trip to Russia and back, and just continue that on until I even don't know how long he can do it. Maybe say for another 3-6 months, possibly, maybe a year. I don't know how American taxpayers will view president who is for a year and a half or 2 years is talking and talking and keep talking. That will become a hilarious melodrama. It will become kind of incredible. So Trump, in my opinion, has a limited time to continue doing what he's doing. who will define exactly what that time is? I don't know, few weeks, few months. Jonathan, what do you think?
I think there's the will of the United States to continue doing what it's doing is a lot more than you suspect, and I think the again the shall we say the uh, unknown card in this entire thing is again what Ukraine will do, because again the United States cannot completely tell Ukraine what to do. They can try to apply pressure. They can try to persuade. So, oh, you need to agree, and Ukraine will not. Ukraine does have cards to play, and I'm convinced that the Ukraine will play a decisive card of its own choosing within the next few months, before the end, certainly before the end of this calendar year, and that will change the situation substantially.
So you're talking about what Ukraine may do differently
Right.
than what it does before.
It doesn't all depend on what the United States itself
You,
does.
but you agree with me that Trump has no card to play against Putin. Nothing, no cards whatsoever. And Trump understands it, and Putin understands it, and it's quite possible Zelensky understands it as well. And then all European leaders understand. So then all Trump can do is to, the best case scenario for Ukraine would have been if Trump tomorrow or next week will get Nobel Peace Prize. And once he's got that, then he said, what the hell with peace in Ukraine? You can continue to fight as much as you will. I walk away. I got my Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and the end of story. Maybe that would have been the best. And then Ukrainians would understand that they have to work with Europeans and try to contain. That would be real situation where Russia would be contained. But I'm afraid it's going to happen without Trump and U.S.
That could well be the case.
Would be, yeah.
It could happen that way. That the Europeans have already indicated that they're willing to spend up to 5% of their GDP, raise their defense spending,
Yeah.
and that could be if the Europeans do that in conjunction with a successful military offensive by the Ukrainians, as I've pointed out before, that combination to me is the one which is most likely to gain Ukraine its permanent independence from Russia.
Jonathan, my point is in this example that he'll get the Nobel Peace Prize next week or two or so. Of course, it's not going to happen, but it may happen anytime soon. You see, in this case, when he's got his goal, because if Ukraine has one goal, Russia another one, Europeans, for Trump, the goal is to get Nobel Peace Prize. Once he will get that, then his thinking could be the following. Okay, so I got my Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. So now there's going on fighting. Nobody wants peace. Zelensky may want peace, but Putin cannot afford peace under any circumstances whatsoever. So now, so we can stay aside and let them fight, and some Europeans will do this or that, or we will actively support Europeans and encourage them to buy as much of American weapons as possible. It's a good business for America. It's a good business for American company. It's good business for workforce who are working on this military enterprises. Then why not to encourage Europeans and Ukrainians to continue the war with the all available weapons being sent and supplied to Europe and then to Ukraine? What's wrong with this?
Nothing wrong with it insofar as if you believe that sufficient military force will eventually compel the Russians to, by virtue of the fact that it's simply incapable of continuing a military offensive of the scale necessary to defeat Ukraine. And if they can do that, and since as long as the Europeans have the notion that their future security and existence and freedom of potential subjugation by Russia depends upon their successful support of Ukraine in resisting the Russian invasion and defeating it, well, then that strategy stands a chance. It requires persistence, much as the Cold War strategy of containment required persistence. You couldn't just neglect it. You had to sustain that strategy for several decades. So in this case, I don't think it will take several decades to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. It may take even considerably less than a year if certain other economic factors and demographic factors and other things which we are seeing signs of now, if those come to pass. But short of that, just as Thomas Jefferson once said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Well, in this case, eternal, if necessary, eternal persistence and resistance is the price of freedom. So in this case, especially when you are confronted by an opponent such as Russia, such as Putin, who is totally fanatically devoted to the restoration of the Russian Empire, and that can only be stopped by decisive military defeat.
100% agree with you, Jonathan. I would like to thank you very much for today's program, and have a great weekend, and all our listeners. And we'll see you on Tuesday, same place, same time. Glory to Ukraine and to
God bless America. Yep.
Canada, and
throw Canada in there for good measure. God is very generous and gracious.
Thank you so much. Bye bye, everybody.